The Dream of a Ridiculous Man is a short story by Dostoevsky. Its length doesn't take anything from the philosophical punch you feel when you read it. The story is told from first-person perspective. The narrator doesn't tell us his name. What he tells us is that he is a ridiculous man. He doesn't care about anything. He believes in the meaninglessness of life. This feeling of emptiness was spreading in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, especially with Darwinian evolution, and it was more so the case for Russians because of communism. The narrator embraces ridicule, he laughs at himself, and is not bothered by being mocked by others. On a gloomy evening in the streets of St. Petersburg, on the way back home, he was startled by a little girl in ragged clothes. She was running at him, beseeching his help. Apparently her mother was dying and the little girl was in full panic. He told her to look for a police officer because she made him feel uncomfortable. She continued beseeching him and he just waved her away. He had a room that he shared with other lodgers. He didn't tell us what he did for a living, but we assume that he didn't earn a lot of money because he couldn't rent the whole flat. And despite his meager means, he had books on a table. The belief in the meaninglessness of life was more rife within intellectuals. Simpletons didn't have to fret about life, its meaning, or the lack of it. What they knew of communism was what pertained to their wages and to the terminology they had to use in their everyday lives. The philosophical underpinnings of communism meant little to them. His neighbour in the adjacent room was a retired captain who was accustomed to hosting loud parties at night. The narrator wasn't bothered by all that noise because he too didn't sleep at night. He would stay awake until it was almost the morning. He had been doing that for a year. He would stay up in his armchair until it was almost the morning and then he would sleep. That night he did as usual. Then he took out a revolver, a gun, which he put on the table. The narrator was suicidal. He wanted to kill himself. He had been wanting to kill himself for some time. To him life was meaningless, nothing mattered, but he still felt corporeal pain. This was common in suicidal ideation. It is the process of thinking or pondering about suicide. He wanted to end it all, but he feared pain. His fear was not related to what might happen after suicide. It was more of a hedonistic fear of the pain that might result from tearing or burning the skin or the failure of a body organ in case he used poison. That night he had another reason to put off his suicide. He was feeling regretful over not helping that girl, and he reasoned that if he were truly ready to part with life, he wouldn't feel any remorse. This puzzled him, and he decided to postpone his suicide. Yet we know that he had had the revolver for some time, and that other nights had passed when he hadn't met any girl. He still clung to life. He was afraid of committing suicide and would take any reason not to. Then he put down the revolver and slept sitting in his armchair, something he had never done before. And he dreamed a vivid dream full of details and immersion. In his dream, he took the revolver, aimed it at his heart and shot it. The moment he shot the bullet into his heart, he didn't feel any pain. He just sank into blackness and paralysis. He couldn't see anything and he couldn't move, but he could feel that he was lying on his back, he could hear people around talking, and he felt being put in a coffin and transported. This was it. This was the answer to what happened after death. Surprisingly, he didn't vanish into nothingness. His consciousness didn't dissolve. He was aware of everything, he just couldn't see or move. Then he was put in a coffin and he lost count of time. Still conscious, he could feel drops of water finding their ways through the sealed coffin and landing on his eyes. All of a sudden, his grave was torn apart, he was grabbed by something and dragged upwards in the sky. He regained his ability to see. It was clear that the entity dragging him was non-human. It was capable of flying at wondrous speed. What was happening was more evidence against everything he thought would happen after death. Their journey through dark, unsettling space continued until they reached a twinkling star near to a sun much like our sun. As they were entering the orbit of the star, he could see landscape, oceans and forests. As soon as he was deposited on the star, the creature that transported him left. Then he started to explore where he was. It looked a lot like what we would qualify as an island. He noticed that the scenery was similar to what we had on Earth, but it felt like everything had a festive radiance. Everything was welcoming the narrator, from vivid colours to the rustle of leaves dancing to a gentle wind, to birds that fearlessly descended and perched on his shoulders. Then he got to see the people who inhabited the place. They were smiling, dancing, joyful, beautiful people like he had never seen on Earth. They greeted him with smiles and kisses. The place that the narrator was transported to looks very much like biblical heaven, like the Garden of Eden from which Adam descended, a place where everything was radiant and ethereal. Those people took him with them to their homes. They were strange. They were happy and tranquil. They didn't fear or apprehend anything. They were in a constant state of joy. Even their interaction with their surroundings was strange. He couldn't understand how, but he felt like they could communicate with the trees, the plants and the animals around them. The narrator was in awe. Much he couldn't understand. He kissed the ground on which they walked. He kissed their feet. He even secretly worshipped them. They knew he did, but they didn't feel any shame at it. There was no reproach. He lived with them for many years. Never did they do anything to offend him, and never did their joy diminish. They sang every night about how ecstatic their day was. They begot children, but the act of procreation was not linked to lust. The children were raised by everybody. They sang songs about each other, and they praised each other. Then the narrator would sully them. Unintentionally, but the result of something he did would deprave that idyllic society. Although he showed them how lying could be used in jokes and pestering, but the moment they discovered they could withhold the truth and advance lies, they grew a liking to falsehood. They descended into selfishness, fear, cruelty and lust. It was inevitable that all this would get bigger and graver, and it did. First blood was shed, and this accelerated defilement even more. They separated into groups and factions, and to differentiate different groups from each other they used flags and built temples and created different creeds. Their cruelty extended to animals. They hurt each other and everything around them. Animals started to fear them. They invented justice and punishments. They were aware of their wickedness, but they were confident in science. They could make things. They could build technological gadgets. They believed in science and abandoned every ounce of belief in something that was bigger than them. Dostoevsky was spiritual. He believed in Christianity, especially after he went to prison. He valued faith more than reason. In a letter he sent to a woman in 1854 he wrote, "Even if someone were to prove to me that truth existed outside Christ, I should choose to remain with Christ and not with the truth." The narrator clearly fits the description of the biblical serpent, who corrupted mankind and caused their downfall. The reliance on science is used to denounce Europeans' belief in Darwinism and abandonment of God. Communist philosophy is also an attempt to challenge religious beliefs. The narrator tried to remind them that they weren't always like that. He tried to teach them back their old ways. He tried to tell them that they used to have something much better than what they would ever achieve living the way they did. But they laughed at him. He felt agonizing pain at what he had led them to. He wanted them to kill him, but they didn't. They branded him insane and commanded him to stop blabbering all that nonsense about another way, or they would put him in an asylum. He felt depressed. Then his dream ended and he woke up. After assuming the role of the serpent, the narrator took the role of a prophet who sought to reform but who wasn't listened to. After the narrator woke up, he was a changed man. He was no longer nihilistic. He was warm and content because he thought he saw what humans were capable of: absolute goodness. He had hope in humanity. But you can argue that those perfect humans are not comparable with the humans in our societies, because even those perfect humans were perfect because they didn't have any choice. They didn't know there was another way to be. And as soon as they discovered debauchery, they descended into it. This pushes us to think about human nature, whether humans are inherently good or inherently bad. Let's consider two opposing views of two different philosophers, the view of Hobbes and that of Rousseau. In his book Leviathan, Hobbes argues that humans are inherently bad. If we were to live according to our instincts, our lives would be short, painful and barbaric, because we're naturally selfish and we will do anything to prioritize our own gains. This would result in all of us stealing from all of us, murdering all of us, and having very painful lives. He argues that the only way to have better lives is to surrender some of our freedoms to a sovereign. By that he means a king or a strong authoritative government. This sovereign would impose limitations on our liberties and would impose laws that would make our lives better. We would not be in constant fear of being attacked or stolen from. This sovereign might be oppressive or unjust, but it didn't matter because the majority of people would benefit from living under it. Rousseau completely disagrees with that. He says that humans are inherently good. It is external influence that turns them into bad people. He says that Hobbes formulated a general statement about the nature of mankind based on the specific example of the English Civil War, and Rousseau gave a counter-example. He used the example of ancient hunter-gatherers who lived in structured, peaceful societies without having to surrender to any sovereign. It is the advent of the agricultural and the industrial eras that brought with them the defilement of humans. They planted the seeds of social division, inequality and fear. This ignited competition for status and turned humans into self and other destructive beings. Rousseau's thesis is that we're inherently benevolent and that it is modern lifestyle that defiles this goodness. In the short story, the narrator agrees with Rousseau because he saw how humans behaved and how they lived when they were uninfluenced by anything. In the story, he represented the element of influence, and at the end of the story, he is hopeful and optimistic because he thinks that this goodness can be reinstated. Now, this video has reached its end. Until we meet again, have a great day.